Because one thing I've learned is this, in politics and in combat, cowardice is contagious, but so is courage. And if you're willing to be the first person over those ramparts, you will be shocked at how many people will come with you. I'm asking you to come with me. I'm asking you to be a part of the generation that will restore the promise of this country and breathe new life into it.
Hi, this is Nick Freitas, and welcome to Making the Argument. Today, what we're going to be doing is discussing a little bit more about the issues that we're going to be addressing between now and Election Day on November 3rd. Now, our process for this was really simple. We wanted to address a couple of things. One was the whole idea of how do we go into argumentation? How do we use science and data and experience in order to come up with good solutions? And how do we do the proper work of defining our terms, not mischaracterizing the other side's viewpoints on this, but really having a good open discussion on what do we think are the most reasonable ways that we can work together both in our communities or through government in order to affect the sort of changes that we want to see. And we didn't want to just assume what it was you wanted us to talk about. We actually went into the district and we talked to people about the issues that were the most important to them and ones that they wanted answers to from me as someone that is going to represent them in Washington, D.C. And so we've got a good list here. And so for the next several weeks, here's the different podcast episodes that we're going to have. We're going to do one on transparency and reform within government. No matter where you go, everybody wants to see Washington, D.C. working better and more effectively. They want to see it operating within its constitutional boundaries. They want to see people working together on those things that we agree on and a little bit less vitriol on the things we don't agree on. And so we actually have some great policies we're going to lay out in order to achieve greater transparency and reform with the way that Washington, D.C. does business. Criminal justice reform and police reform. Obviously, across the country right now, people are watching what's going on in Milwaukee, Portland, Richmond, Seattle, and they want to see what our approach is to actually addressing good, solid criminal justice reform, while at the same time ensuring that we actually have safe and secure communities. And so we're going to dedicate an entire episode to just going over that and some of our ideas for that. Education. Everyone right now is confused. Can their kids go back to school? Can they not go back to school? What will it actually look like? And what is a common sense approach for reforming education in such a way that we can make sure that all of our kids get the education that they deserve, and we can also ensure that those kids which don't have the same financial opportunities still get access to a good and quality education that sets them up both for social and economic success in the future. COVID-19. Need I say more? We're all looking for what is the government's appropriate response during a pandemic. And this is one of those areas where I do think that there's a lot of room for people to come together because dealing with something like a pandemic is a legitimate function of government. And so we're going to be talking more about what the government should do at the federal, at the state level when it comes to combating something like a pandemic. The economy and jobs, always one of the top issues that people have. And obviously there is a certain role that the government plays in either helping the economy or hurting it. And we're going to be talking about the various ways that the government should act or should not act in order to make sure that we're expanding the economy and ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to be able to participate, find their place, do what they love, and be able to take care of their families at the same time. We're going to talk about taxes and regulation. And there's a reason why we're doing these two podcasts together, because obviously your economic policy has a lot to do with the taxes and regulations that the government puts into place. Every tax is always sold to us as a way to help people. Every regulation is sold to us as a way to protect people. But that's not always the case, or maybe we should say that those policies don't always have the intended effect. And so we're going to go and review various taxes and regulations and see what their impact has been on the economy. We certainly don't doubt that there's some legitimate functions of which taxes are necessary. We don't doubt that there's some regulations that are important to make sure that the government is doing the job it's supposed to be doing. But where is the line, and how do we work within that environment to make sure that we're maximizing people's ability to keep what they earn and to start a business without constantly having to look over their shoulder for the next government regulator? We're going to talk about prescription drug prices. Obviously, with the pandemic, the whole idea and concept for how we get a particular life-saving drug from concept and theory on a whiteboard somewhere out to the market where people have access to it is very important. So we're going to be talking about the FDA's role and what sort of reforms that we want to see in order to make it easier for people to get the prescription drugs that they need. We're going to talk about foreign policy and national defense. This is something that is near and dear to my heart, having done 2 combat tours in Iraq with 1st Special Forces Group. National defense is one of the primary responsibilities and the reason for the federal government existing in the first place. And so having a very coherent foreign policy and national defense strategy which keeps the United States safe, which protects our allies when necessary and appropriate, but by the same token respects the fact that we are not the world's police force is absolutely critical. And we're going to be laying out some of our strategies for ensuring that we do that effectively and in accordance with the Constitution. We're going to be talking about the environment. You know, it's fascinating to me that a lot of times people think that if you're a conservative, you don't care about the environment. Nothing could be further from the truth. We want to be good stewards of the environment, but the real question comes down to who is better at ensuring that we actually have the economic development, the technological development, the scientific development to ensure that we have a good, strong, sustainable economy that includes everyone, while at the same time protecting our natural resources and our environment in general. And there is a good conservative approach to this, and we're looking forward to talking about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about healthcare in general. There's nobody that doesn't think that our healthcare system in this country needs significant work and overhaul. But once again, the question is going to be, what is the best approach to it? Do we need more government control over the healthcare system? What sort of government controls do we already have? And is it yielded the results that we actually want? Or do we need a different type of reform that actually puts more power into the hands of patients and doctors as opposed to bureaucrats and lobbyists? Again, it's another episode that we're really excited to talk about because we do think that there's a lot of area and agreement on what our end state should be. We want everyone to have access to quality and affordable health care, but the way we get there looks significantly different, and we're going to do the compare and contrast on the different approaches. So that's a recap of the 10 different subjects that we're going to be talking about over the next several weeks. We're really excited to be able to go into depth on each one of these policy positions and lay out specific things that we plan to do in Washington, D.C. in order to empower people to be able to make more decisions over their own life. So as we talk about these 10 various issues, these 10 various policy points, I want to start first by talking about the approach that we're going to use, because I really think that it is absolutely time that we have more civil discourse about these issues. And there's a couple different ways we can do this. So my objective in all of this is not to bash the other side or not to treat my opponent in this race as if she's mean-spirited or she doesn't know what she's talking about. That's not the point at all. The real question here is, how do we go about solving these problems? Everyone I know in politics wants to solve problems. The real question is, how do we do that? And one of the first things that we have to do is define our terms. Because if we want to have a productive conversation, then we can't engage in straw man arguments where we're creating a caricature of the other side's argument and then just knocking it over. We can't let it descend into nothing more than ad hominem attacks where we're trying to attack the intentions or the character of somebody else that may disagree with us on a policy position. The way I try to start off a conversation is by agreeing on a couple of things. First of all, we all agree that the issues that we just talked about are significant issues and challenges that we need to face, and we all agree that government plays some role in addressing them. So we've identified the problems, we've identified the challenges. I would even go so far to say that we largely agree on what the end state should look like. We want people to be happy, healthy, prosperous, and free. So if we can agree on the challenges and we can agree on what the end state is, now we're just arguing about the process. And that's going to be a significant issue. But sometimes it helps when we've established that we have the same starting point and we have the same end point. If all we're arguing about is the directions to get there, I think it actually allows us to foster a far more productive conversation. And it reminds me of I'll tell a quick story about a civics class. It was a high school civics class, and they were asking me about civil discourse and how do we add more civility into politics. And I said, well, there's essentially 3 things that you have to do. The first thing that you have to do is don't assume negative intentions because you have different policy positions. So simply because my opponent disagrees with me on a lot of the policy positions, I don't automatically assume that that means she has ill intent or she doesn't care about people. I just assume that we have a different way of getting there, and really the argument should be about the process. Again, it's about the directions to get to where we both want to go. And if we can agree on that, then and not automatically assume negative intentions, it makes productive conversation a whole lot easier. one of the other things that we have to do is check our tone. So if every single time that we get into a discussion, the sarcasm automatically comes out, or it becomes a very, very bitter discussion right off the bat, it's going to be really, really hard to be able to have any sort of common ground or find where there's those areas where you can work together. And one of the things I like to say is if I disagree with you 90% of the time, that still means there's 10% that we can agree on and work together on. And so why don't we focus on the 10% first? It doesn't mean the 90% doesn't go away, but what I found is that when people get used to working on the areas they agree with, they're a lot more likely to find equitable compromise on the things that they disagree on. So focus on the 10%, then focus on the 9%. Those are two very, very important components to civil discourse within politics. But then we get into the third realm. And this is where it gets a little bit more contentious. And this is going to lead us into the competing political philosophies that we're discussing right now. One of the most important ways to maintain civility within a discussion on a very important topic is to agree that before you even begin the discussion, neither side is going to force or coerce or threaten the other one to do what they want. And unfortunately, we've entered into this realm right now when if you have a government-centered approach to solving problems, then by definition, you are relying on a far more coercive way to solve problems. Because when the government comes up with a solution, it doesn't really ask your opinion. Those solutions are usually created by politicians, maybe lobbyists, maybe very, very small groups that have political access, but ultimately they will be decided by a government entity, and then the rest of us will be directed on what we now have to do in order to carry out the, quote, government solution. And so it is inherently a very coercive way to solve problems, a very top-down approach to solve problems. And I think that actually leads to less civil discourse within politics, because at the end of the day, if all we're arguing is not different ideas, then we're all free to go out and try in order to see how it works. If what we're really debating is which side is going to win and then force the other side to do what they want, well, then the stakes are a lot higher and people are going to get a lot more frustrated with the overall nature of our politics. So what is a different way that we can actually solve problems that doesn't actually require coercion? And that's what I call the community or the marketplace of ideas-based solution. And that is when we actually look at problems from a standpoint of how do we come together, talk about different problems, come up with different solutions, and implement them. Now, that doesn't mean that we're forcing everyone to implement our solution. It could mean that a community comes together and they come up with 2 or 3 different ways to approach a problem. And maybe what they discover through that process is that one of those approaches worked best, and so they end up just naturally adopting it because it produced the best results. The other thing that they might realize is that multiple solutions were actually the appropriate way to address the problem. Because one of the things I found is that even within small communities, there's multiple ways to address an issue. But when you're talking about a country of 330 million people spanning an entire continent, there's almost definitely multiple ways that you can address problems, because those problems or those challenges manifest themselves differently based off of communities, based off of geography, based off a whole host of issues that cannot be effectively addressed with a government-centered, one-size-fits-all approach. And so one of the things that I focus on, not just because I believe it produces best results, but because I believe it actually allows us all the freedom to be able to exercise different points of view, different perspectives, and come up with different solutions, is the community or marketplace of ideas centered approach to problem solving. And that's going to be one of the biggest things that differentiates political discourse. So not only for the sake of civility, but also for the sake of actually getting to what we really want, which is that end state of people being happy, healthy, prosperous, and free. The thing I would ask you to really kind of focus in as we talk about these contrasts is this a government-centered approach or is it a community-centered approach? And which one actually yields us the best results, both from a civil discourse component, but also from an effectiveness and an efficiency component as well. So that's what we're going to be doing over the next several weeks. And quite frankly, I'm very excited about this because almost every campaign consultant out there will tell their candidates, when you're running against an incumbent, don't get into specifics about policy, just hammer away on their voting record. And honestly, I think that's one of the problems that we have in political discourse right now. This is not a personality contest between Congresswoman Spanberger and myself. This is not to be something on who can put out the most attack ads on the other person. This is supposed to be a discussion about ideas so that voters can be able to decide for themselves on who best reflects the approach that they want to see in Washington, D.C. So I'm excited about this. Now, there's some things I've got to ask from you, because obviously, if you're watching this from the 7th District, I'm potentially going to be the person to represent you in Washington, D.C. And so as we approach these issues, we don't want to just rely on our own research and study. We want questions from you so that we can ensure that when we actually lay out our policy positions, we are specifically addressing the concerns you have on these 10 issues that we've laid out. So if you go to podcast.nic4va.com, you will see a list of this schedule, and you'll be able to ask those questions, which we will incorporate into the podcast in order to make sure that we are giving you a comprehensive answer so that there's no confusion. Because the last thing I want is for anyone to be confused about where I stand on the issues or how I'll vote when I get to Washington, D.C. For the last 5 years in Richmond as a delegate, none of my constituents have ever been confused on how I vote, because I'm very honest with respect to how I represent people and what I believe and what I think needs to be done in Washington, D.C. So as we go through this process, please go to podcast.nic4va.com and give us your questions on those policy issues. Also, please share these. We want as many people across the country, but specifically here within the 7th District, to be able to send these podcasts to people whenever they have a question on where I stand on the issues. There's going to be a lot of TV ads. There's going to be a lot of campaign mail coming from a variety of different groups telling you where each of us stand on the issues. I want you to hear it from me directly. And if you run into someone, friend, family, coworker that has a question, I want you to know where you can go to get the answers and share them with them, coming directly from me, not from an outside group, not from my opponent, but coming directly from us. Again, we are looking forward to these next 10 podcasts. We're looking forward to your input so that we can make them as relevant to you as possible. Again, thank you very much for all of your support and joining us on this podcast. And please, once again, remember that you can give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also find this podcast on Spotify. And if you ever have any questions on what we're going to be doing next, go to nic4va.com. And once again, to submit your questions, go to podcast.nic4va.com. And we're looking forward to the next 10 weeks.